New spec for evokers, as you may have heard, it has been data mined for a while actually in 10.1. Or is it going to be in 10.07? Well, we don't know because things have been moved around, and if you've been following any of the dev interviews, we don't know when things are going to happen anymore, but things have been happening in WoW, so we might as well discuss what the new spec for Evoker will be once it will be put into the game, because at this point, devs, you cannot tease us anymore. We gotta have that new spec because, I want it. Now, besides what I personally want, let's look at what we get. First of all, you might have seen certain videos and articles and data mines out there regarding a certain support spec as well, and obviously we have theory crafted ever since Dragonflight beta that with the black Dragonflight spells, we will probably have a tank evoker as well, because it doesn't make sense. So let's dive deep into these potential new specs for Evoker. First of all, the more widespread topic would be the support spec for Evoker, and this comes a little bit at a weird time because as far as support is concerned, when the community says support, they're thinking of kind of like a healer, but not necessarily a healer. Something that essentially buffs people, debuffs enemies, and supports classes. We know other styles of RPGs with other style of team compositions where you have the support roles. One common example would be Heroes of the Storm, a kind of dead game for Blizzard that has the healer concept in it in a team of 5 players, but also a support style spec where it does some damage, but its main goal is not to heal the party, but actually make the party better. The closest example that we have for this right now in WoW at this day that you can play with is Power Infusion. Power Infusion, and of course, to some extent you can think of, raid-wide buffs. But Power Infusion essentially is you take one class, the Priest, and you choose another class and you boost that class's damage and haste by, a certain amount. And that would be the closest thing that we have for support. Other style support mechanics could be something like Leap of Faith, where the Priest grabs you, or Rescue from Evokers, where you're just being moved around and stuff like that, where you can interact with your party members in different ways than simply just filling up their HP bar or giving them an overall buff that is just passive there for like 30 minutes, right? So these are the kind of boosts. Now, whether or not the support spec will actually make into the game, because, we all know the controversies with Power Infusion, is besides the point. We are going to talk about what that means. Well, first of all, we have data mined a couple of quests in 10.1 that happen after the story of 10.0.7 is concluded with the Evokers, where you're going to follow a couple of quests by liberating, probably prior to the raid on Aberrus, one specific black dragonfly that has been imprisoned by an Neltharion. And that black dragon is Adamanthia. So the story goes, long story short essentially, is that during the Dractyr's creation, Neltharion specifically refused to put a lot of black dragon essence into the Dractyr. As you know, the Dractyr and Evokers essentially have essences from all of the flights. You have yellow and green for kind of the healing stuff, although red also heals, red also deals damage, blue also deals damage because blue is like the mage style of Evokers, and you have about, I think, only 2 spells at this point, maybe 3 spells from the Black Dragon aspect. You have Obsidian Scales that give you damage reduction. Ooh. You have Deep Breath, where you just, the quintessential spell where you fly across the battlefield and blast things, and you have Landslide, where spikes come from the ground and root everybody in. So those are, to this day, the only Black Dragon spells that we have, because the rest of the flight's essence has been refused to be put into the Dractyr in their creation by Neltharion, one who apparently opposed it in the lore, and I might be rough on the lore here, but doesn't really matter. Adamanthia wanted the Dractyr to have more Black Dragon essence, and Neltharion imprisoned her, and we're going to rescue her, kind of. She's also gone crazy, and I'm not going to go too much into details, but during the process of rescuing Adamanthia, in the last phase of the quest, we need to choose a role. We've had these quests before where we fight a boss in a scenario, but obviously we will need somebody to tank, somebody to heal, and somebody to DPS. And seeing as Evokers can either DPS or heal right now, we don't have any other option. But there is an option in the text that has been data mined that you can choose a tank specialization, or at least a tank NPC to tank for you. You can choose one of the NPCs to establish their role. We've had this before, to do something that you cannot do, and you can choose an Evoker to be your tank. And I think the name is Stoneclaw. We have the name Stoneclaw for a bunch of NPCs in WoW at this point, but one Evoker can actually be the tank in your encounter. And obviously you cannot, because you cannot be a tank. You are either preservation as a healer or devastation as a DPS. Now, first of all, obviously, this kind of implies in the lore that evokers can actually tank. And seeing as how evokers as of this moment in the lore are only restricted to healing and DPSing, because from the dev interviews we know that this is all that evokers know to do. This is what they've been credited to do. They don't know anything else. Obviously, they will learn future classes in the future. We know this from devs, but the fact that one can actually tank in the game when they've said that, you know, evokers are limited to, or drag tiers are essentially limited to only evokers, is actually really interesting, and it does kind of imply that we can have a tank specialization. Not to mention that I think Morgan Day talked with Towley some time ago in a dev interview that initially they thought of a tank spec for drag tiers when they were, you know, for evokers when they were, you know, working on them in the Dragonflight expansion, so that's not out of the way, although it's not currently still in the game. And the whole concept of freeing Adamantia, the dragon that opposed Deathwing and wanted us as drag tier evokers to have more Black Dragon Essence, kind of implies that we can unlock that Dragon Essence and unlock more defensive spells, aka potentially the tank spec. Now, on top of all of this, there are also more data mines. There's a tweet specifically by Porter Gage, who essentially tweeted a data mined tank chosen option that you can get for the drag tier Stoneclaw that can actually tank for you in the Adamantia quest to kill the boss. So we already know that. There's also a Reddit post with more data mining from one called Scottish Wanderer, and Scottish Wanderer posted a bunch of stuff on top of and we'll go into them eventually, but one important thing is that we have a data mine spell animation of what looks like a shard of earth moving towards the target. Now that is clearly a Black Dragon spell, which means that we will, or at least in the game files, there are rather more Black Dragon spells that essentially evokers can use. Whether or not we will actually have them, whether or not they have been scrapped because they don't want to add that, doesn't really matter. We're here to look at the data that we have, and that's actually really interesting and does hopefully support the idea that we will have a tank spec. Now, it could be a tank spec. It could also be the quote-unquote support spec, because also in the quest to free Adamantia from her madness, or we're gonna fight her, whatever, help Abyssian and so on, we have a specific quest called the Contingencies. And in the quest text that has been data mined, you can read as follows. As the energies release, Adamantia is coming to and is driven mad by torture of ages. Help buy Abyssian time to subdue her magically. And it's a boss fight, and we have boost/heal Abyssian and Emberthal, most efficient method, or throw damage on Adamantia. High flavor fight, lots of banter. This is basically in the quest text, which is probably going to alter as the quest becomes available for us to test. But the interesting thing is the option to boost an NPC, essentially. We've never had this term before, and you obviously could have, if they meant buff, they would have said buff, but it's definitely said as boost, which could essentially imply that there will be a new style of spells that can boost allies, boost NPCs. Obviously, we're gonna, you know, speculate and extrapolate from this. Not to mention that I mentioned before, the Reddit user that has data mined a bunch of stuff, has data mined new spells in the database, new empowered spells for evokers that are not currently available. They have been quickly renamed and readjusted by the devs, so probably we don't have access to the data mine anymore, but there are a couple of screenshots that you can see, plus the link is down in the description if you want to check all of this out, that essentially point us towards the direction that there is at least a third spec for evokers. Now, whether or not that's a support class, because we have the boost concept, and, you know, people have been asking for support classes for a while, or we're gonna finally have the Black Dragon spec kind of tank, which is something that a lot of people have been also kind of wanting. Who doesn't want to be that Dragon Knight? It remains to be seen. So far, we have data mine text and spell animations and quests and all of that stuff that point us into both of these directions, which I guess it's kind of funny because they could be either one. In the vast theme of WoW and World of Warcraft Dragonflight, it would make more sense to have a tank spec because Black Dragons are a tank. There are numerous reasons as to why this is. Neltharion was the Earth Warden, the protector of Azeroth, the shielder. The warrior artifact weapon back in Legion is a shard of Neltharions, the prot warrior, by the way. A shard of Neltharion, which is basically your shield. you from your shield. If I recall, the old ability for Pro Warrior, you shoot Dragon Breath out of your shield, which is silly, but doesn't really matter. But it is the concept of Black Dragons around Protection Warrior, around tanks. So it's clear, if Black Dragons can be anything, they can definitely be tanks. Big, beefy, a lot of health, big armor. That's essentially what's going to happen. That doesn't mean that we cannot really have a support, although the chances of Evokers having 4 specs, 1 extra support and 1 tank on top of the 2 already existing, is a little bit unlikely, so will remains to be seen. But what do you think? What do you want? Do you want the tank or do you want the support? Or do you want both? Although both is a little bit unrealistic. The devs are kind of iffy on whether or not we're gonna get this expansion or next expansion or in the next patch or not. It was definitely initially planned to be unlocked as we progress into 10.1. Now, whether or not there still is time to add this into the game on top of all of the other reworks that are happening remains to be seen. But fingers crossed, and devs, please give us a 3rd spec. Appreciate it. Thank you for watching the video. Thank you to Patreons for supporting the content and making all of this possible. And we will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.
I've been loving it then, I still love it now. Still, I play WoW. Still, I play WoW. Getting better every day, let me show you how. Cause still, I play WoW. Still, I play WoW. It's getting harder to stay, but at the end of the day, it's a guilty pleasure, so just log in and play. Whether it's classic or retail, I'ma do a /bow. Still, I play WoW.